The rain fell so hard that every drop against the pavement sounded like a small detonation. In the middle of that empty street stood a figure, shirt soaked through, hair plastered against his face, and in his hand, something that looked nothing like treasure, a rusted, ancient key. Behind him, 3 luxury SUVs pulled away one after another, their windows down, laughter spilling out into the wet night. His aunt's voice cut through loudest of all. "Enjoy your basement, sweetheart. We'll send you a postcard from the Bahamas." The cars swerved past a curb puddle, splashing him as they turned the corner, and he just stood there, drenched, silent. His fist tightened around the key. The narrator's voice drifts in low, like someone sharing a secret. "They thought I got nothing. A rusted key, a flooded basement, a joke to laugh about over champagne. But they had no idea what Grandpa really left me. They had no idea that this key, this worthless piece of junk, was about to unravel 50 years of their lies." The camera pushes in on the key, then cuts to a flash forward. A gala hall, chandeliers glittering overhead, a lawyer's face draining of color as he opens an old file. His hands tremble. Behind him, the family's expressions shift from pride to dread. Narrator: "By the end of tonight, they wouldn't just lose their fortune. They'd lose everything they thought made them who they were." The screen cuts to black. One line fades in. 3 months earlier. 3 months earlier. The Whitmore estate sat behind iron gates so polished they caught the sunset like mirrors. Inside, the family moved through their world the way royalty moves through a palace. Unhurried, entitled, untouchable. Richard Whitmore, the eldest son, stood by the pool reviewing stock reports on his phone, a glass of scotch sweating in his other hand. His wife lounged nearby, discussing which designer would handle the renovation of their 4th property. Their teenage daughter scrolled through vacation photos from a trip to Monaco, already planning the next one. Across the lawn, Diane, the sharp-tongued aunt who would later mock a boy in the rain, was on the phone with her interior decorator, debating marble finishes for a wine cellar that didn't need one. "Money isn't the goal," she liked to say at dinner parties. "Money is simply what happens when you're better than everyone else." She always laughed after that line, and the room always laughed with her. At the center of it all, presiding over dinners and holidays like a monarch, was Patriarch Edmund Whitmore. 83 years old, sharp-eyed and dying, though he hid it well. He watched his children and grandchildren with something the family mistook for pride. It wasn't pride. It was disappointment carefully buried. Only one person in that family never quite fit the mold. Ethan, Edmund's estranged grandson, the black sheep, son of a daughter the family had quietly erased from photographs and conversation decades ago. Ethan wasn't invited to the pool parties. He wasn't in the group photos. When he did show up to family gatherings, it was to stand at the edges, politely enduring the same tired jokes about his modest apartment, his ordinary job, his wasted potential. Nobody in that glittering family noticed that Edmund's eyes lingered on Ethan a little longer than they lingered on anyone else. Nobody noticed the old man's quiet, unreadable smile whenever Ethan spoke. They were too busy admiring their reflections to see the storm quietly gathering at the edge of their perfect world. The law office of Harrison and Cole occupied the top floor of a glass tower downtown, all polished mahogany and hushed carpet, the kind of room designed to make people feel important. On a gray Tuesday morning, the Whitmore family filled it wall to wall, dressed in black, though none of them looked like they were grieving. Edmund had passed quietly in his sleep 3 weeks earlier. The funeral had been brief, tasteful, expensive. Now came the part they'd actually been waiting for. Attorney Marcus Cole cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. The room leaned forward as one. "To my son Richard," he read, "the Whitmore estate on Maple Crest, along with the family's controlling shares in Whitmore Holdings." Richard exhaled slowly, a satisfied smile creeping across his face. "To my daughter Diane, the lake house, the art collection, and $2 million in liquid assets." Diane's manicured hand pressed to her chest in practiced humility, though her eyes gleamed. Name after name followed: yachts, vacation properties, trust funds for the grandchildren. The room filled with quiet, self-satisfied nods. as if they were simply collecting what had always been theirs. Then Cole paused, adjusting his glasses, scanning the page again as if checking he'd read it correctly. "And to my grandson, Ethan Marsh." A ripple of confused glances passed through the room. Half of them had forgotten Ethan was even invited. The key and full rights to storage unit 114, located beneath the old Whitmore textile warehouse on 9th Street. Silence. Then laughter. Diane's laughter, sharp and delighted, quickly joined by the others. "A basement," she said, wiping a tear of amusement from her eye. Edmund really did have a sense of humor. Ethan sat perfectly still at the back of the room, the eyes of his entire family on him now, waiting to see him crumble. He said nothing. He simply reached out and took the small manila envelope Cole slid across the table. Inside it, a single rusted key. As the family filed out, already laughing about brunch reservations, Diane paused beside him just long enough to whisper, "Enjoy your basement, sweetheart." Ethan closed his hand around the key and said nothing at all. That night, Ethan sat alone in his small apartment, the rusted key resting on the kitchen table in front of him like an accusation. Rain tapped against the window, the same slow rhythm it would fall in 3 months later, though he didn't know that yet. He turned the key over in his fingers and let his mind drift backward, 20 years, to a summer afternoon he hadn't thought about in a long time. He was 8 years old, sitting on the porch of Grandpa Edmund's old house, before the mansion, before the empire, back when Edmund still smelled like pipe tobacco and old books instead of expensive cologne and boardroom victory. The rest of the family was inside, arguing over something trivial. Out on the porch it was just the two of them. Edmund had knelt down to Ethan's height, an unusually serious look on his weathered face. In his hand was an old photograph. A woman Ethan didn't recognize, standing in front of a modest brick building, smiling like she knew a secret worth keeping. "Do you know what your family thinks makes them powerful, Ethan?" Edmund had asked. Young Ethan shook his head. "Money, houses, the things people can see." Edmund had tucked the photograph into his coat pocket, his eyes distant. "But money burns, houses crumble, and things people can see. Those are the easiest things to take away." He'd placed a weathered hand on Ethan's small shoulder, his voice dropping to something between a whisper and a warning. "Knowledge is the only true wealth. Remember that. The truth doesn't disappear just because people choose not to look at it. One day you'll understand what I mean." At the time, it had sounded like the kind of thing old men said to make themselves sound wise. Ethan had nodded politely and gone back to playing, and the memory had faded into the ordinary blur of childhood. Sitting at his kitchen table now, key in hand, 20 years later, the words didn't sound like nonsense anymore. They sounded like a map. Ethan looked at the rusted key for a long moment, then finally closed his hand around it. "Okay, old man," he murmured to the empty apartment. "Let's see what you actually left me." The next morning, Ethan sat in his car outside the old Whitmore textile warehouse, key resting in the cup holder, and didn't move for nearly 20 minutes. Doubt had crept in overnight, the way it always did in the quiet hours. He kept replaying the will reading, the laughter, the pity in some faces, the barely concealed contempt in others. He thought about the years of small cruelties that had led to that room. Birthdays he wasn't invited to, a college graduation none of them bothered attending, a family group chat he'd been quietly removed from without explanation. He thought about his mother, gone 11 years now, and the way the family had spoken about her at the funeral like she'd been an embarrassment to manage rather than a daughter to mourn. Nobody had ever told Ethan exactly why she'd been pushed out of the family decades earlier. Every time he'd asked, the subject changed, doors closed, conversations ended. And now here he was, inheriting nothing but a key to a room in a warehouse nobody in the family had mentioned in years, while cousins who'd never worked a day in their lives walked away with mansions and yachts. Maybe Edmund's whispered words on that porch really had just been the sentimental mumbling of an old man. Maybe there was no hidden meaning, no map, no truth waiting to be found. Just a broke, forgotten grandson about to waste his Saturday standing in a flooded basement, proving once and for all that he really was as insignificant as they'd always made him feel. Ethan's hand hovered over the car's ignition. Part of him wanted to drive away, go back to his ordinary life, and let the Whitmores have their perfect, glittering world without him in it. But another part of him, quieter, stubborn, the part that still remembered a weathered hand on his shoulder, wouldn't let him leave. He picked up the key, stepped out into the gray morning air, and walked toward the warehouse's rusted service door. The service door groaned open on hinges that hadn't moved in years, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of dust and old paper. Ethan flicked on his phone's flashlight and stepped down a narrow concrete staircase into the dark. What he found wasn't a basement. It was a room, vast, low-ceilinged, stretching farther back than the flashlight's beam could reach. Rows of steel shelving ran floor to ceiling in every direction, each one packed with cardboard boxes, leather-bound ledgers, and file folders yellowed with age. A single bare bulb flickered to life when he found the switch, casting long shadows across what looked less like storage and more like an abandoned library. No gold, no cash, no hidden safe stuffed with jewels. Just paper, decades of it, maybe a century's worth, coated in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Ethan walked the first aisle slowly, running his fingers along box after box. Labels in faded ink read things like shipping records 1962, 1968, employee ledgers, textile mill correspondence. He felt something in his chest sink lower with every step. This was exactly what his family had laughed about. Worthless junk, the leftover paperwork of a company that had been sold off generations ago. He kept walking anyway, deeper into the rows, the beam of his flashlight catching dates stretching further and further back, 1950s, 1940s, further still. Whoever had built this archive had been meticulous, almost obsessive, about preserving every scrap of the company's history. Then, near the very back wall, half hidden behind a stack of collapsed boxes, his light caught something different. A single steel lockbox, newer than everything around it, its surface free of the dust that coated everything else. Someone had placed it there recently. Someone had wanted it found. Stenciled across the lid, in handwriting Ethan recognized instantly from old birthday cards, were 7 words that made his breath catch in his throat. The truth behind the empire for Ethan only. Ethan crouched in front of the lockbox for a long moment before he touched it, his flashlight beam trembling slightly against the steel lid. His own name, in his grandfather's handwriting, felt like it belonged to some other version of his life, one where he mattered enough to be planned for. He tried the latch. Locked, of course. He searched his pockets for the rusted key from the will, but it didn't match, too small, the wrong shape entirely. Frustration rose in his chest, quick and hot. He turned the box over, shook it gently, searched the surrounding shelves for anything resembling a second key. Nothing. For a moment, standing alone in the flickering light of that underground room, the whole thing felt cruel rather than mysterious. A locked box with his name on it, and no way in. One more Whitmore joke, except this time signed by a dead man instead of a living relative. He almost laughed at the thought, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He sat back against a shelf, dust settling around him, and let himself feel it fully for the first time. Not just disappointment, but something closer to grief. He'd wanted so badly for the porch conversation to mean something. He'd wanted, just once, for his grandfather's attention to have been more than pity for the family's forgotten branch. Maybe there was no puzzle to solve. Maybe Edmund really had just been a sentimental old man rambling to a child, and Ethan had spent 20 years quietly building a fantasy out of half-remembered words. He almost stood up to leave right then, ready to lock the warehouse door behind him and never come back. But as he pushed himself up off the floor, his hand brushed against something taped to the underside of the shelf above the lockbox. A small, brittle envelope, hidden just out of sight of anyone who wasn't looking closely enough to feel around in the dark. His fingers closed around it, and for the first time since he'd walked into that basement, his heart began to race. Ethan peeled the envelope free from the underside of the shelf, its edges brittle with age, and carried it back beneath the flickering bulb. His hands weren't steady as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and a small brass key, ornate, old-fashioned, nothing like the modern lockbox latch it seemed too delicate for. He unfolded the letter first, and his grandfather's handwriting filled the page, shakier than he remembered it, clearly written near the end. If you're reading this, it means you didn't walk away. Good. That's the first test, and most of them would have failed it after the first 10 minutes down here. I know what they gave you looks like nothing next to what they got. I know how it must feel, sitting in this basement while they toast champagne in a mansion. I need you to trust me a little longer, Ethan. Everything they have, the estate, the company, the name they're so proud of, none of it was ever really theirs to inherit. There's a truth in this building that's been buried longer than you've been alive, and you're the only one I ever trusted to find it. Use the key. Open the box. And Ethan, once you start reading, there's no putting it back together the way it was. Are you sure you want to know? Ethan read the last line twice, his pulse loud in his own ears. Somewhere above him, faint and distant, he could hear the muffled sound of traffic. The ordinary world, still turning, unaware that everything was about to change. He picked up the small brass key, walked back to the lockbox and fitted it into the latch. It turned with a soft, satisfying click, decades of silence finally giving way. He lifted the lid. Inside, packed tightly and wrapped in aged plastic sleeves, were dozens of documents. Deeds, letters, photographs, and one folder thicker than all the rest, its tab labeled in faded red ink, Whitmore versus Marsh, 1974. Ethan's own last name, staring back at him from 70 years in the past. Ethan sat down right there on the concrete floor, the folder open across his knees, and began to read. And with every page, the world he thought he understood quietly came apart. The first document was a property deed from 1952, registering 40 acres of prime city land, the same land the Whitmore mansion now stood on, under a single name, Eleanor Marsh. Not Whitmore, Marsh, Ethan's own last name, 74 years before he was born. He kept reading. Letters between Eleanor and a young textile investor named Harold Whitmore, Edmund's own father, revealed the truth in fragments at first, then all at once. Eleanor Marsh hadn't been some outsider to the family fortune. She'd been its founder, a brilliant, self-taught businesswoman who'd built the original textile mill from nothing, who'd owned the land, the machinery, the contracts, everything the Whitmore empire would later be built on top of. Harold Whitmore had been her business partner. And then, according to a series of bank correspondences dated 1955, he'd become something else entirely. A notarized transfer document sat near the bottom of the folder, signed Eleanor Marsh in looping cursive. Except stapled behind it was a second document. A handwriting analysis, commissioned decades later, comparing that signature against verified samples of Eleanor's actual handwriting from letters and checks. The analyst's conclusion was typed in flat, clinical language that hit Ethan harder than anything else in the box. Asterisk, the signatures do not match. Forgery highly probable. Asterisk. Eleanor Marsh, Ethan's great-grandmother, a woman he'd never once heard mentioned at a single family dinner, had been quietly erased from her own company's history, her ownership signed away in ink that wasn't hers, while Harold Whitmore's name rose in its place on every deed, every contract, every letterhead that followed. Ethan's mother had been Eleanor's granddaughter, which meant every dollar, every property, every gleaming inch of the Whitmore empire had grown out of land and money that had never legally stopped belonging to his own family. He sat in the dust and silence of that basement, holding 70 years of buried theft in his hands, and finally understood exactly what his grandfather had meant on that porch all those years ago. Ethan kept digging through the box long after the shock of the forged signature had settled into something cold.